I'm very honored to have such prominent panelists on this panel. This is the first time, I think, that there is a panel where we are giving an opportunity to hear insights from people who are working globally. And I think the last panel mentioned that the projects performed in Israel are projects performed by international players. I can add to that the Israeli companies are also doing project work abroad. And I thought, and I think, I believe, the discussion should be a global discussion. I mean, I've been involved in the project sector in Israel since the very first projects, Cross Israel Highway and Carmel Tunnels. I think I met Udi there in Cross Israel Highway. And this was like 25 years ago. And it's obvious that this is an international business, not a local business. So the discussion must be an international discussion. And I'm glad we have this opportunity to have this discussion. Now, let me start by introducing the panelists. I think the first one, all the way at the right, I don't know if he needs introduction. I'm sure everyone in the audience knows him, Mr. Oudi Adiry. Udi is currently the CEO of Balilius Group, a leading player in the transportation and energy sector. Previously, I think I attended some of the panels today. I think his name was uttered at least 20 times today. But so prior to leading one of the big companies in the private sector, Udi for many years was in the public sector. He was appointed the deputy in charge of the budget division at the Ministry of Finance, responsible for infrastructure areas. And more recently, he was the Director General of the Ministry of Energy. Udi was responsible also for the field of the water sector. As part of his many accomplishments, he coordinated the work of the First Shashinsky Committee to examine the policy of royalties on natural gas and oil, the Second Shashinsky Committee to examine the policy of royalties from natural resources except from gas and oil. He also dealt at the Treasury in the gas outline, the promotion of private electricity in Israel, reform of the water, etc., 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 etc. So Udi, I will stop there. We don't have all day. Okay. Right next to Udi is Mr. David Goodman. David is a managing director in Kroll Expert Services. It's a practice based, David's practice is based in London, but Kroll originated in New York in 1932. They're a risk advisory firm. I saw that many of the Fortune 500 companies are your clients. David has over 25 years of experience in the construction industry, the last 17 of which have been spent working within project planning, strategic advice, project management, and dispute resolution teams globally. In 2020, David co-authored a chapter of the book dealing with delay and disruption on the construction projects, something I guess the previous panel mentioned. And last but not least, Mr. Carlos LOAYZA, sorry. Carlos is a senior director with Delta, which is an international consulting firm in engineering, accounting, construction, program management, and litigation support. Carlos has over 20 years of experience in design and construction of civil and mechanical projects and on project advisory. Carlos has worked on projects located in the UK, Europe, Middle East, Africa, Asia, and South America. None in Australia? Not yet? Okay, so Australia too. We covered all continents. Carlos is experienced across a broad range of project sectors, including real estate, oil and gas, power generation, transport infrastructure projects, offshore construction, shipping, government, and public sector projects. All right, I think we have a good team. And when we thought together what would be most appropriate to have for discussion from a global perspective. I think the one thing is what are the keys for implementing a successful project. I think the name of the panel is if I could turn back time, because a lot of time we look back at the projects we were involved in, and we were thinking maybe we could have done things better. And the idea here is to see whether the same obstacles that we are seeing in the projects are also obstacles which are found globally, and what are some of the keys for overcoming those obstacles before we hit them or as we hit them. So this is the purpose of the panel. I do, however, want to relate to the panel before us and use the opportunity that Udi in his last position was the Director General of the Ministry of Energy, and tell you a little story. It just dawned on me because I came back yesterday for a meeting in Germany with one of the biggest, I would say, manufacturing companies in Germany, Linde, and they are involved in the Intel project, currently the new Intel project currently constructed in CARIOS, and we met with a very senior officer there who showed us around. They have a huge complex, and he told us that all of it was constructed or started in 1880, and the company was started by a German engineer who invented the refrigeration process. And he invented the refrigeration process because at that time, the beer gardens in Germany, they used to chill the beer with ice cubes that they carved from the river, the frozen river. Unfortunately, Udi, in 1880, the global warming started. They could no longer use the rivers for producing ice to cool the beer gardens, and this ingenious guy thought of a different solution. So from beer, we came to refrigeration, and this is linked to the last or the previous panel where one of the panelists discussed our target, or the government target, humanity's target maybe, of zero carbon. Probably you know something about this, Udi, and how we can achieve it using different ways, or or how do we approach this problem in different ways.
Yeah, so it's a known thing that necessity is the mother of all invention. So it's important to have targets to reach somewhere. I think that first of all, there are many ways in which the climate change is a worldwide issue, but there are many ways in which governments can make the market go and lead to the direction they want. Because putting the policy in place is complicated, whether it's carbon emission, whether it's building public transportation. Putting the policy in place is complicated. The governments know how to do it, usually. They have to be stable to say things that make sense over time, but they know how to do it. It's much harder to execute. And when it's come to execution, that's where you meet the real interconnection between the public sector and the private sector, and where it's become much more complicated. And I think that there are a few things that are extremely important in order to make this thing happen. So one thing is the question: how do you work with the private sector? Because one way, which is also always option, is to tender out your policy. You want to have renewables, let's do a tender for renewables. You want to build an LRT, let's do a tender for an LRT. It has a lot of advantages. It's most competitive. It should be the cheapest, and sometimes it's the best option. But sometimes, I was the minister. You asked me about my experience. I was the Director General of the Ministry of Energy, and what did I want? I wanted to reach the 10% renewable target in 2020. It's not too much. That's all I wanted. And then you tender it out, and you get from the market results that you can hardly believe how cheap is the prices that you get, because it's a tender, and there are 20 bidders, and each one put the lowest price. You're happy for one night. Then in the morning, you discover you were drunk. You have hangover. Nothing happens. Everybody asks you to give them more time, to help them a little bit. And I think in a way, it's a catch-22 that sometimes the government is capturing. I saw it in energy. By the way, in energy, one of the things that was spoken also in the previous panel is in some stage the government said, okay, so we want to have renewables, we want to have storage, so let's open the market. Let's take this tender and say you are allowed to sell to consumers in order to finance your project instead of PPA with the government, and it seems to be working. Our group, Talmond in the previous panel, is the CEO of our group, BL Energy, which do storage, and it's recovered the market. On the other hand, in public transportation, it's another field that we are very active in. We are the owner of Superbus. So it's the same idea. The government, what the government wants? The government wants the government wants to increase the uses of public transportation, to which 40% use of public transportation instead of public cars. So we tender it out, competitive tender, lowest prices, and then afterwards. So in a way, it's one of the challenges is to find the right balancing, to make the cheap but effective connection between government and private sector. It's not always simple.
Maybe you guys want to grab a microphone because I saw you smiling, David and Carlos. So I'm sure you have to There's one on your right. Yeah, that one's on. No, they were not cheap here, so everyone has his own microphone. So you guys were smiling when Udi said about, one day you see that you have a cheap bid, and that company is awarded a bid. Then the next day you discover you're drunk and not from drinking beer. So there's a tension between the price of the bid and the ability to perform, which Udi related to from the standpoint of the public sector. But what are your thoughts on this?
So I think, along with Carlos, we look at projects at the end when they're in dispute, and the themes that you see are global. We both work all over the world. I've got a project at the moment that it hasn't gone particularly well for both parties, and we're looking at a dispute, and the winning bid was $350 million lower than the next bid, and you think, wow, what do people think they're buying when such a bargain's put on the table? Because it has, as with many of them, it's just led to so many problems, and similarly with time, it's everyone puts a bid in. There's 4 contractors that say it's going to take 5 years, and there's a contractor that says he can do it in 3, and they say, well, we're going to get this project done in 3 years, and then all the everything that you can imagine going wrong goes wrong, because it was totally time and money totally unachievable from day one, and either naively or strategically they've been given the project, and unfortunately or fortunately we're at the other end trying to work out exactly what went wrong.
Yes, I couldn't agree more with both of you, and I think, well, we see different causes of problems in projects that are in distress, but from the point of view of execution, in my opinion, what tends to drive most of the risks or the reasons why projects go wrong are twofold. One of them is obviously cost constraints, and the other one is political pressures to finish those projects. So once you have the implementation from the government, when you potentially want to get the cheapest option quickest, what tends to happen from the point of view as execution is, well, let's try and do that. Let's fit in the budget and within the program that the buyer wants, and let's hope for the best. And hence, here we are talking about, if we could turn back time, what can be done to resolve those issues.
Yeah, Udi, I think Carlos mentioned that a lot of the time the program is just a political decision. I mean, no one really does. I don't want to say no one really does, but I'm not sure how much of a decision of when the project will be implemented is a political one, how much there is a thinking process behind it, an analysis behind it.
So probably the answer is it depends, but not all the fault is always on the politician's shoulders. Sometimes it happens. Also, officials will make mistakes. I think that, you know, if you want to take an example, and you know, if we had a time tunnel, so, you know, 2 weeks ago the red line was open, the red line of Tel Aviv. By the way, I heard that the traffic priority is not working yet, but the project was open, and I had the privilege to take part in this project about 15 years ago, and there was a decision to be made. So, for example, one of the most important things, if you want to execute a project correctly, is a lot about the risk allocation. So we began the project with a very easy solution. All risks are going to be assumed by the private sector. In the PPP, it's the easiest, right? And then you discover that there are things that private sector cannot be accounted for, cannot assume responsibility for, such as permits from the municipalities at the beginning of the project. In the other end, in the end of the project, it cannot deal with the challenge of the forecast of ridership 30 years from now in a network that does not exist. So this is one hand. On the other hand, what we did, and you know, I don't know if it was a mistake or not. I personally think that it was. We decided to do the project with contractors, but then it was divided into about 10 contractors. So then someone need to deal with the integration. The Israeli government had no experience in that. So in the end, the risk allocation was on the government. The government could not deal with the integration. So I think in that way, in that sense, that we did learn some lessons. So I hope, for example, that the green and purple line, which are going to be constructed soon, and very soon there is a tender of the operation, I hope that the lesson has been learned. On one hand, some of the risk assumed by the government, such as permits, but the others, when it comes to integration between systems and rolling stocks and maintenance, on the side of the private sector. So there are a lot of professional decisions to be made. I don't think that politics is too much involved in that. Politics sometimes has to do with the decision whether to build the project or not, but in the end, in Israel, from my experience, in both sides, many in the governments, the execution is much more important than the ideas that might be thrown by politicians here or there. That's the challenge, and I think you need to learn from the lesson. That's the important thing.
Yeah, you spoke about risk allocation, and I've often spoke in different opportunities about my view that since Cross Israel Highway, which I think was a fairly balanced project in terms of risk allocation, probably mainly because this was the first BOT project performed in Israel, and the Israeli government at the time hired the services of Hanan Melcher, and he looked at what is the norm globally, and the end contract that was signed was very much similar to other contracts that we see globally, where the risk allocation is balanced. It wasn't a FIDIC or anything like that, but still there was a good balance. And over the years, I've criticized the fact that the Israeli government or the people who administrated the contracts for them put more and more risks on the private sector. I think the pendulum is probably swaying again more to a balanced place. Some of the lessons learned, I guess, in the Jerusalem LRT, where the government initially put too much risks on the private sector, and then the future tenders, you saw some of it was fixed. David, maybe you can address what happens when too much risk is put on one party in an unbalanced way.
I think, again, on any major project, both parties have got to have a satisfactory outcome. Both are in it, there needs to be a joined up way forward. And if you're at that point in time, and again, looking historically at projects, the amount of time argued over who owns the risk and who has to deal with the risk, it's just wasted energy, when actually what you want is in the perfect world, a project where both sides are trying to achieve the same outcome, and both win, because you can't have it where it's so unbalanced that there's a winner and a loser, because that's going to just have a massive influence on how the project's being undertaken. If you feel that the pressure is on you the whole time, you're looking for excuses, you're looking for avenues, and you spend so much energy trying to deal with that rather than deal with the project in hand. And it just, everyone has to feel that they're gonna win at the end of the day. Both sides have to have a joined up winning outcome. And if you haven't got that, then as we see, conflicts start. And once conflicts start on a project, they just explode, and it never ever really recovers. They re-baseline, they sign supplementary agreements and all sorts. But once you've lost that joined up drive and joined up goal, then you really do hit problems.
Carlos, you want to add to that?
Yes. Well, I think we got to this quite early, so I may not have anything else to say on this, because this was going to be my takeaway message. Is the risk management paradox, and it's exactly what Adi was saying just before, that in the drive to divest risk, not just governments but also contractors and companies have started subcontracting, implementing measures to do that. But by doing that, what we have done is generate even bigger risks. For example, that coordination risk, when a government or a subcontractor packages a project in several contracts, but then someone has to own the risk of coordinating all of those contracts, which tend to inevitably go wrong and create chaos, not just for one of the packages, but for all of them. So I think my takeaway message from all of this, in my experience going back to the late 90s or 2000s, was to someone or somehow needs to retain some of the risk knowingly, retain that risk and that knowledge in-house, and that would potentially be a happy medium for the happy execution and successful conclusion of projects.
I think this brings me to the next point. I mean, we're trying to identify really the key issues that we need to consider, and which are paramount or at the base of the success of a project. And we have identified some of them, but I think one of them, and maybe it's sometimes overlooked, is something, David, you talked about, is that the parties need to have a joint interest. And I call it, jokingly, a lot of the times when I'm explaining to people about PPPs, I say PPP stands for people, people, people. And in this business, I guess it's in every business, but also in this business, we're not dealing with concrete, or we're not dealing with solar, we're dealing with people, as it is with every other business. And I'll give you an example, because for me, people, the people is also the partnership, the joint interest you talked about, but it's also the leadership. Do we have a leadership? I can give you an example from two of the projects that I worked on in the past. I think the first example is Cross Israel Highway, where it was very easy to see the leadership. Why? Because the prime minister who decided that this company is going to be led by an general from the IDF, late Moshe Vachetzi. He saw it as something, it was his project, okay? It wasn't the concessionaires, it wasn't the contractor. I remember I was in a meeting with him. He shouted at the people of the Treasury Department. Udi was probably at that time with the Treasury Department. And he shouted at them, it's not your project, it's my project. And that project, by the way, was completed on time, on money. It's a great success on quality. On the other hand, the first project that Israel tried to implement for LRTs, which is the Jerusalem Red Line, you saw a lack of leadership. Why? Because the government still didn't know who's the owner of the project. On the one hand, you said you had the municipality of Jerusalem. On the other hand, you had the Ministry of Transportation. On the third end, it was a triangle, was the Ministry of Finance. And these guys were supposed to meet once a week and manage the project. That's impossible. So it's about people, it's about leadership. Udi, maybe you can give your perspective on this issue.
I think you put the finger in a very important place. A project must have an owner, someone that owns the project. And if the someone that needs to do the execution, for example, the tender committee, does not represent or does not belong to the owner of the project, so then the outcome is that instead of moving forward the project, what becomes more important are the obstacles and the detail, not the aiming of reaching there. And I think that one of the things that we did and is important, that in each sector you need to have the owner. For example, in electricity, in energy, it's relatively working in the sense that the PUA, the Public Utility Authority, is the one that also is not only the one that put in the policy, but also the one that put, it's not exactly tenders, but put the tenders. And they are accountable for their success, and they work in teams. They have the Ministry of Finance within the PUA, and they have the Ministry of Justice for everybody, but they are responsible. And in a way, that's what we try to do also in the purple and green line. I don't know if it worked or not, but we said Neta, the company of Neta, is the father and mother of the project. Is going to be the chairman of the tender committee. It was not the same with the Jerusalem LRT that they probably remember. The first time I saw you, I think you were shouting at everybody in the meeting because it was a disaster. And it was like, there was the Ministry of Finance that like was the chairman of the committee, but the project was not belong to the Ministry of Finance. And I think it's extremely important. The project has a father and mother in the government, but also on the other side in the private sector. And even if you have a consortium of few companies, which sometimes is the solution, you must have also there someone who assume responsibility and see the project as his own mission. Otherwise, it's a mess, because risks and our decisions need to be taken in order to move forward with the project. You know, I remember a small example. We did the heavy rail to Jerusalem, which took many years, and there was some things that were not finished historically, but we need to move to make progress. So we gave the Israeli Rail, as a Minister of Finance, I gave the Israeli Rail an authorization to move forward with some of the tenders. Then the מבקר המדינה, the auditor, they said it was irresponsible because the project might have been stuck afterwards. But if you want to move forward with the project, you must take risks.
I was just going to add, totally agree, but you need leadership, but you also need fair leadership as well. Because what another theme that you do see on disputes, on projects is the bullying side of leadership, where the one side can do no right. You know, they everything. So if you're the contractor and you're submitting claims for entitlement and they're just thrown out, they're not looked at, thrown in the bin, go away, don't darken my door again. It's just, that's another, sometimes you see leadership that goes too far the other way, that just results in, again, you just have this departing of ways, and So leadership also needs to be fair, I think, is the point.
Just to ease the crowd, when you talk about leadership being fair, you're not talking about Israel. This is from your global experience.
I'm talking about leadership in a global construction project where, and you see it all the time, that we're there 5-6 years later, and there's all these entitlements that were never looked at, that were thrown in the bin. And okay, some of them maybe belonged in the bin, but some of them, there are grounds that need investigating.
When one party is acting unfairly, this is where it's difficult to find the common interest, because you're saying he's bullying me, and especially Israelis, we are accustomed to defending ourselves. So when someone bullies you, it's very hard for us.
But the bully feels that they're the strong leader, and it's that kind of.
When I worked for the government, I thought that the government is always fair. Now I understand that the government always works according to the contract, but it's only one aspect of fairness. Sometimes fairness requires other things than working just according to the contract. And for a good surprise, I find it in the private sector, sometimes you can find even more fairness in that sense.
100%.
That's correct. I think another key, and I think it was actually the CEO of Neta who mentioned it, and he mentioned it as one of the obstacles they're facing, obviously with the metro in the future, is getting experience on your projects. David, maybe you can relate to, not David, sorry, Carlos, how paramount is having experience on your project to successfully achieve your targets?
Oh, I think that's hugely important and goes hand in hand with what I was saying before about retaining some of the risk and managing that risk. That goes in this specific point, that goes linked with retaining your people and retaining your knowledge in the company. Again, in my experience, what at the outset feels like an expenditure, for example, when you have a big project and you finished it and you let your people go, that will be then hugely painful when you have to rerun that learning curve because you have lost that experience, relive the same mistakes, and therefore have the same painful outcomes. I've always, I have 2 stages in my career. The first one working for a contractor where we've had several successful projects because the people involved had done it before. And I think there's no substitute for that in the government, in the private sector, in the execution of big and small projects. Experience, in my opinion, is paramount. And that's something that we need to cultivate and retain as much as possible in every project that we execute.
I was just going to add, I've got a dispute at the moment that's offshore wind farm, 54 turbines, and the contractor that got awarded the contract had never built an offshore wind farm before. No idea how they got the contract, and unsurprisingly, it's been very problematic. But again, either the price was too good to turn down, or the program was too good. But this is their first offshore adventure.
I think what we're seeing, of course, there's emergence of new industries and new technologies like solar, which is relatively new, and we're also seeing a globalization of projects. I mean, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, no one would have thought they would have performed projects anywhere in the world. I guess you guys can set me straight if I'm wrong, other than with the local labor and probably mostly by local companies, but things are different now.
Well, everyone is everywhere. We work globally, and there are amazing movement of materials, humans, plant. It's total globalization, which is probably, as you say, the last 10, 15 years is unbelievable. That a project in Scotland has, resources from the Middle East, equipment from the Far East. And then that all leads into logistical issues that you're trying to get stuff across the globe which I think from the kind of COVID and the Ukraine crisis, logistics have suffered massively. Trying to move stuff that a few years ago was relatively easy has become much more difficult.
Yeah, and specifically on renewables, again, going back to the topic of risk, I've seen two very specific risks to those projects because they are relatively new. I've seen several projects that have suffered from the risk of new technologies, so untested or prototypes that are just being installed for the first time. That's generally an issue that causes problems or distress. And the other one is new entrants to the market. That goes hand in hand with what David was saying about contractors that have absolutely no experience in a field getting in there. And that could be for many reasons, because of scarcity of contractors in the region, or the ones that know how to do it are all busy or have a very long leading time. So that takes, or that originates those risks that sometimes are inevitable in the current circumstances where we are building new technologies and changing the way we generate power.
And also pay for experience, which again goes all the way back to the contract price. If you want experience, you have to pay. You can either pay for someone who's got no experience that might be cheaper, or you pay what the correct price may be.
You can't buy a Rolls Royce at the price of a Volkswagen, right? Yeah. I want to end this session with one key we haven't discussed yet. And I want to ask you a riddle. And the riddle is not mine, actually. It's from my favorite kids book. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's in Hebrew, so, but I will tell you, maybe some of the people here can guess what it is. It was written by an Englishman, actually. It's called The Hobbit. You may have heard of it. You may have read it. So, by the way, one story before we go, I have to share this story with you. The first edition of this book in Hebrew was actually translated by a group of pilots, Israeli pilots, who were held captive in Egypt. Some of them, they needed something to do to pass time. Some of them knew English, others did not. The ones who knew English told the story to the ones who didn't, because they received a copy in English. And together it took them around 4 years, and they translated it, and that was the first edition of The Hobbit. And I'm telling this for a couple of reasons. One, because this is, I'm trying to bring the international experience here, and part of it is understanding the narrative. So this is part of the narrative that Israel is built on. And the second reason, which I hope the crowd will support with applause, is that that narrative of Israeli pilots translating The Hobbit was important, is important. We grew up on it, and we want to keep it that way. So if you want to applaud, you're welcome to applaud to this. No applause. I lost everyone. I will explain to you later. Anyway, so in The Hobbit, there is the famous encounter of Frodo, right? And Bilbo and Gollum. And basically, they have a test of riddles. And if Bilbo wins, then because Bilbo is strangled in a cave, he doesn't know how to get out. And if he wins the riddle contest, the Gollum will show him the way out. But if he loses, then he becomes the Gollum's dinner. Okay, and this is the riddle. And I'll ask the riddle. If someone from the crowds know the answer, you're welcome to raise your hand. If not, no, not now. Let me ask the riddle first. And then I'll ask you guys. Okay, so this is how the riddle goes. This is the last riddle of the Gollum. Then he thought the time had come to ask something hard and horrible. This is what he said. This thing all things devours, birds, beasts, trees, flowers, gnaws iron, bites steel, grinds hard stone to meal, slays king, ruins town, and beats high mountain down. Wait, don't answer. Those of you who know the answer, raise your hand. Only one. Those of you who want to guess? David, you want to go? Yeah, what's...
I was going to say time.
Poor Bilbo sat in the dark, thinking of all the horrible names of all the giants and ogres he'd ever heard told of in tales, but none of them had done all these things. He had a feeling that the answer was quite different and that he ought to know it, but he could not think of it. He began to get frightened, and that it's bad for thinking. Gollum began to get out of his boat. He flapped into the water and paddled to the bank. Bilbo could see his eyes coming towards him. His tongue seemed to stick in his mouth. He wanted to shout out, "Give me more time, give me time." But all that came out with a sudden squeal was, "Time, time." Bilbo was saved by pure luck, for what, of course, because that, of course, was the answer. So time is the untamable monster. And I want to end up, because we know, Udi mentioned the Tel Aviv Red Line, originally supposed to open in 2010, opened August 2023. So time is the untamable monster. I want to leave off by your ideas on what we can do to tame the untamed monster. Carlos, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, I think very quickly, two things. Be realistic on your programs and your expectations. So both sides of a project have to do that. And the other is retain some of the risk in-house.
David?
Yeah, I'd totally be realistic. The amount of projects you see that just start with an unrealistic timetable and it just goes downhill from there.
I agree, but after you did it, you should take your project and look like this. Say the only thing I care about is moving forward with the project, because people and institutions to disturb, there will always be plenty of. There should be one person who said, "I want to get there."
Thank you, gentlemen, for an interesting panel. I think I learned that the problems we're facing are global ones, and the solutions, well, we can look outside to discover some of the solutions and hopefully adopt some of them. And next time we're not gonna say, "If I could turn back time," because we know we can't. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.